about that now.
I heard someone say it was like our midterm.
Yeah. So if you missed Friday, or even if you were here on Friday, Mr. Kelly, I know every single one of the girls were like, "Oh, I hope Mr. Kelly today." Young, handsome dude there. Not jealous. Certainly not jealous of Mr. Jordan's black belt karate or Mr. Brown's not having an ounce of fat on me. Not jealous of that at all. So what if I don't work out like Mr. We get that teacher. For the third period it does. Anyway, Chia was like, I just like his energy. What am I? Chopped liver? I'm just kidding. He's going to be a good teacher, I think. So is Miss Gillen. Okay, now what was I saying before I started to spiral into shame and jealousy? Midterm exams. You said I was random. That's about as random as you can get. Midterm exam. There's some weirdness going on with the schedule. We're doing things. The front office is telling us to do things differently than we've ever done them before. So I actually asked, because I'm confused. So I asked Mrs. Scott if I could meet with her tomorrow and talk about it. She said yeah, tomorrow. So I won't have answers for you about that exam until Wednesday, probably, or willing. But yes, he did give an assignment out. Who wasn't here on Wednesday? You were here, right? Okay, yeah. So if you have the World War One warm ups or the World War One causes quiz yet, which is some of you, right? Right. You need to get that in ASAP because it's late. It's officially late. It's been officially late. Second, there's no need right now to do any work on that midterm exam, like 5-paragraph essay that he gave you, right? So just hold off on that. I'll have more answers on that later. Okay. Does that answer the question? Kind of. There's no other work given. I might put on Google Classroom a link to my son's YouTube channel. He's 8 years old. I just want him to get views and subs. So thank you. I appreciate that. Did I put it on? I didn't put it on Classroom yet?
I mean, maybe you did. I'm not sure.
How did you find out about it?
Reached out.
How did he find out?
I have no clue. He just texted me.
There's an FCA group me. Are you in the FCA group me?
They did with me. My group me didn't. They wouldn't be doing it.
There's an FCA worship night tonight, by the way, at 6 p.m. Okay, so enough with all of that. Just wait on that. We'll get on that. Maybe I'll put my son's thing up there and you can give him a like.
What is it about? I saw it was like war dogs.
So animals of World War One, and you just do some research and type some stuff out. But what I haven't done is given you specific like a rubric or anything like that yet, because it was his assignment. So that's one of the pieces of feedback I need to give him. What was the rubric? See, he's not perfect. He might look. Okay, now let's get into this. Some of the stuff that you have been taught about World War One in my class already for like the past 5 days. A lot of you, am I wrong? Like, if you didn't know all of it, like it came back to you pretty much, and it's familiar with you, and you obviously did well on the quiz. So, if you took the quiz, so we're good there. But the stuff that we haven't done as much yet, like in your high school, junior high career, is like the American version of World War One. What role do the Americans have in it? And so that's what this is about. If you know a lot about this, then great, good for you. I am going to like hammer on the reasons for our entry into World War One like a boss these next 3 days. That's my plan. The next 3 days. I'll talk about the home front. It'll be a lot easier. There won't be as much expectations there. There'll be some more chance for discussion, but like this stuff, I'm really I'm not gonna hammer this home. There's gonna be a big assignment on this on Wednesday that you get to work on. So, like there, number of points. So that's that. Flip on the back of your handout, if you will. You can see on there. We may not have time to get to this, and if we don't, that's fine. It's no big deal. But this is where I want you to think. Anyway, this is where I'm going to try to lead you. I want you to form an opinion about our getting involved in World War I. Because remember, it starts in 1914 in Europe. 1915, 1916, 1917 is when we officially declare war. That's like 3 years. 3.5. 3. And we don't really start sending troops until 1918. So our involvement in it is very short. And the question is, were the Americans acting nobly when they entered World War I in 1917? What I mean by that is, was it a righteous cause that we were involved in? Were we getting involved in the war for the right reasons? Were we acting on pure principles, or was it more about greed and selfishness and arrogance and pride and all that kind of stuff? That's what I want you to formulate an opinion on. Okay, so it's going to take 2 days, probably 1.5 days to get to help you see that. So let's go ahead and go. First, let's talk about presidents that we've addressed already, but I just want to remind you where we've been. Theodore Roosevelt is essentially the first president of the 1900s. I know William McKinley was part of that, but he was assassinated in 1901, so he doesn't count, right? What goes in this one? Here are the Rough Riders. He had this cushy government job, assistant secretary of the Navy. He probably would have never had to seen the front lines of the Spanish-American War if he didn't want to, but he resigns from that position. He goes down into the jungles of Cuba and he fights on this cavalry. Cavalry means horseback riders, right? What's the famous battle that he's a part of down there and the Rough Riders are a part of? I know you know because you drew it on your, in theory you drew it on your cartoon comic strip. Who's in Spanish class? How many are in Spanish class? So you should know this. It's the Spanish phrase for Saint John. The Battle of Saint John Hill. San Juan. Woo, there it is. Third period just looked at me like, where's Mr. He's a hero in the Spanish-American War. He gets elected vice president under McKinley in 1901, and then when McKinley's assassinated, he serves and he gets elected in his own right in 1904, and then when he's done, he kind of handpicks his own successor. So he really dominates politics for a decade or more, 15 years really. He was a bully pulpit president, meaning that he was in charge, and he was going to lead the country this way, and if you want to go that way, fine. Otherwise, get out of the way because the train's coming right at you. He was also called a progressive president. He was the trust buster president. He was the conservation of the environment president. He was the friendly to unions president, etc. Do you remember who's the person that he handpicks to be his successor? Who's the guy after him? Yeah, William Howard Taft. What do you know about that?
Was he the guy who went to like the Philippines or one of the territories?
He makes a name for himself by being the governor of the Philippines, and that's really where his and Roosevelt's friendship starts. They became like best friends. But I mean, come on, what do you really know about Taft? Let's think that everybody knows about Taft. How much did he weigh? 350 pounds. What? You never heard anything about the White House bathtub? He literally got stuck in the White House bathtub. 350 pounds. He was about 300, and then he hated the presidency. He thought it was just like awful. And so he gained all this weight while he was 350 pounds. Afterwards, he becomes Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he loves the job, and he goes back to like 270 or something like that. So he found something he loved. But like while he was president, he got stuck in the bathtub and had to be pried out of the White House bathtub. Lesson in life, right? Lesson in life. Okay, so when he is president, he busts twice as many trusts as Roosevelt. So he is a progressive president, but there's a progressive wing of the Republican Party and there's a conservative wing of the Republican Party, and he tends to go towards the conservative side because the progressives don't like his policies on the environment and some other trade issues and stuff like that. And so when Roosevelt is in Africa hunting during his off season of the presidency, right, he hears about what Taft is doing, and he's like, oh my gosh, the Republican Party is split. The Republican Party, he said, was in shambles. And so Roosevelt comes home to the United States, and he starts campaigning for president. He wants to get the Republican nomination away from Taft. Now, he doesn't do that. In fact, in 1912, the Republican nominee was Wayne Howard Taft. Do you remember who the Democratic nominee was, the guy who won? Yes? Who? Woodrow Wilson. He's the guy who won. And who was the Bold Moose Party, the Progressive Party candidate? Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. When he couldn't get the Republican nomination, he formed his own party. They were like, are you sure that you're up for this? Like, I feel fit as an old bull moose. Write down Eugene Debs was a socialist. He got about 900,000 votes. Debs will run for president from jail 8 years after this. Point is, there's a story I haven't told you about that here that is just awesome. Like, you can't make this stuff up. You could make this up, but this is awesome. Okay, so Roosevelt is getting ready to make a speech. I don't even remember where it was, so my apologies for that. But he was getting ready to make a speech. He had his 50-page speech. You think that I talk a lot. 50-page speech folded up, and he was put inside of his pocket, inside of his suit coat. Right? He also had like a tin can in there too. It was like a glasses holder or something like that. By the way, do you know he took 12 pairs of glasses to Cuba when he fought the Spanish American War? 12 pairs, because he was so blind, like not literally, but he was so nearsighted. One where you can't see far away. What I am, I can't. He took 12 because he knew that if he lost a pair in battle, he was dead. Right? I think he used them all. He also talked about how fun it was to just run up the hill and the thrill of just sticking the bayonet right into the enemy's belly. He wrote about that kind of stuff. That was a president, right? Talking about that kind of stuff. Anyway, while he's running for president, he and Taft they were best friends that become mortal enemies because they're just like fighting in the press, like taking shots at each other in the press, kind of like Scottie Pippen is with Michael Jordan and all that kind of stuff right now, and Shaquille O'Neal, if you've been paying attention to that. Anyway, who's Scottie Pippen? You win for the day. I don't have any prize for you, but you win for the day. Roosevelt starts calling him names, and these are kind of names that like Donald Trump would be proud of, right? You know how Donald Trump came up with Crooked Hillary and Sleepy Joe, which really aren't that clever of names. He called Taft a fathead. It had to do with his being stuck in the bathtub. He said that Taft had the brain power of 3 guinea pigs. Didn't even give him like the benefit of giving him like 3 horsepower brain, right? 3 guinea pig power. Like Donald Trump can't even make up that kind of stuff. Anyway, Roosevelt's making a speech during the 1912 campaign, or he's going to make a speech. He's got that thing in his pocket. An assassin stands up, hits him right in the chest, like square in the chest. The speech folded up was so thick that it saved his life because it literally hit where, and you can't make this stuff up, hit where the bullet hit where the speech was. Now, of course, it's going to go into the speech a lot, but it stopped it. It was actually lodged into his upper rib cage a little bit there. And people were like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Are you okay? Let's take you to the hospital. It's like, forget that. He stands up, blood dripping down his side, makes a 2-hour speech. That's Teddy Roosevelt for you. They don't make them like that anymore, right? I mean, for heaven's sake.
That's an old model.
The Taft versus Roosevelt, that split the Republican vote. Woodrow Wilson gets elected in 1912. He was also progressive president. You might remember some of the amendments that took effect under his administration, 16, 17, 18, 19. You've got to know this for government class. If you're in government, you've got to know this for my end of course exam too. 16th Amendment was direct income tax. 17th Amendment was direct election of U.S. senators. 18th Amendment, prohibition of alcohol. 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. All sorts of other things like the Clinton Antitrust Act, Federal Reserve System, which reformed our money, and all of our dollar bills say Federal Reserve at the top now. We've talked about his domestic policies. We have not talked about his foreign affairs policies yet. So that's what the rest of today and the first part of tomorrow is all about. Now, I'm going to pause for a commercial break here. Have I mentioned that my sister's in the Secret Service? Oh, I have? Funny. Not proud or anything. Not riding those coattails. I know that you don't believe me. I can see it in your eyes. You're like, I don't believe you. You lie.
You told us like so many times it's impossible to like not like it's impossible to think you're
I think that you think I'm lying.
I don't
I can see it in your eyes.
I felt hard.
I can tell through your mask that you think I'm lying. I've got photo evidence here, right here. This is Joseph Biden. This is my sister Brittany Renee Hayes, formerly Brittany Renee Beavers.
Slater's
I
very
gotta say
good.
Getty.
He likes to start arguments. We heard this, but he likes to start arguments.
Troll.
How do we know it?
Mr. Beavers.
You could
it's
just
here
say
to-
Just look at his personality test. It proves
It's true.
that. It's 16. Yeah.
Why don't you ask her? Why don't I call her right now?
Then go
Do
ahead.
it.
No, I'm not gonna.
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
got a lot of stuff to get. She probably won't even answer because she's a professional. You know what she said when the family saw this picture? She's like, "Hey, you can see my belly." I mean, I was like, "Are you kidding?" She's in really good shape. Trust me. Her and her husband are like Mr. Kelly. Okay, end of commercial. That's proof. Apparently, if I wanted to purchase a license for this, because that's a Getty image watermark there, I'd have to pay like $270. I'm not paying that, so it's not as clear as it would be. She might be coming in before Christmas. Maybe. Maybe. That's a big maybe. Okay, so what was going on in foreign affairs with America? And what is going on here has nothing to do with Europe. It actually is totally irrelated. It's not related at all to the war, to the fighting happening in Europe. The war is raging in Europe, but in Mexico, we have trouble. There's a bandit named Pancho Villa, V-I-A-A, and the history of Mexico up to this point is basically 1910, the president's assassinated, somebody takes over. 1911, president's assassinated, somebody takes over. 1913, dictator takes over. That's just what happens in Mexico, right? And Pancho Villa doesn't want to have the presidency, but he does want to have a big swath of land to be like king over this part of northern Mexico. And so he's doing all sorts of stuff in Mexico, and we're kind of just like, well, that's troubling. But then he actually goes across the border into New Mexico and kills 19 American civil engineers. Right. So President Wilson can't have that. So he sends John J. Pershing, Black Jack Pershing, down to try to find Villa, bring him to justice. Villa eluded Pershing. Third period did not know what the word eluded means. Do you know what the word elude means? Escaping. Thank you. He's never caught by the Americans, right? Never caught. And then, of course, he goes into Texas, which is American soil. And so Wilson is ticked at this point, and he orders 150,000 National Guardsmen to go find Pancho Villa. And they never find him. You might remember some of this from watching that History Channel video about the World Wars, where George Patton put a machine gun on top of a car. He was trying to go after Pancho Villa's men. Right? They never catch him. One reason was because Villa was seen as a hero by the poor of northern Mexico. They thought that he was like their Robin Hood, and so they were going to protect him and not tell what his movements were to the Americans. Of course, he's seen as a villain by the United States because he's killing Americans. never captured, not by the United States government, not by the Mexican government. He doesn't stop raiding until 1920. So he's been raiding about 5 years up to this point. And the Mexican government just said, fine, have this land up here. And he took it. That seemed to be all he wanted. He stopped raiding, but an assassin did get him in 1923. So that's the end of Pancho. But the point is, and I don't like the way I wrote this up here. When I looked over this, I think it was Friday, when I looked over these notes, I was like, I don't know, maybe I could say this better. This is what goes in the notes. But in the red, this is what I think I say it better here. The problem is that when I wrote it in red, I have a typo. I left out the one from 1916. So our relationship with Mexico is very intense. 1916, 1917. You've got to remember that. Tuck that away in the back of your head for the end of this note packet. Okay. Some political cartoons. William Howard Taft has this Mexican problem, and he doesn't know what to do with this, so he hands it off to Woodrow Wilson, who then, of course, doesn't really know what to do with it. Right? We invaded the city of Veracruz with our navy in 1916. Still couldn't find it. I put this on here because it really reminded me, 100 years later, like almost a year. There's a lot of Trump supporters saying basically the same thing, for different reasons, obviously, but it's just kind of funny to me how history kind of repeats itself sometimes. If this is the border between the U.S. and Mexico right here, by the way, geography quiz, what's this river? Yeah? Good guess, no. It's up here. It's Spanish for big river. Rio Grande. Right? All of these little squares and dots were where he was raiding, but then you can see how many times he went across the border, or his men went across the border and raided. So you can see why Wilson sent 150,000 men. Never caught him. Of course, here's Woodrow Wilson. The Mexican problem is this big boiling pot, and he doesn't know how to handle it. This is Woodrow Wilson's attitude, said a lot of people, a lot of historians, towards Latin American countries, that he's basically a school teacher, and they're like ignorant children, and he's going to teach them how to behave properly. He's quoted as saying something like, I'm going to teach the Mexican people how to elect good men. That's why he sent the military down there. So that's his brand of imperialism there. Okay, what's going on in Europe? We've got a lot of optimism. I mean, late 1800s, early 1900s is the era of human optimism. The modern era is what it's called, and it was the era where we thought that we're going to use science to fix all of humanity's problems. This was the era of Charles Darwin. The progress that the whole world of every single form of life in the world has just progressed to the point we are now, and it's going to keep getting better. And industrialization has just exploded, and we're just having all sorts of amazing scientific advances. And of course, it's also the era of nationalism, which is extremely optimistic because you're saying, I think my people are best. And our attitude, our worldwide, or at least Western European attitude towards the war was also optimistic too. They figured the war starts in August of 1914. They figured it'd be quick. It'd be a jolly good jaunt. And then they'd be home. By which holiday? Christmas. So they'd be home by Christmas. It would take a couple months. They would lure for themselves, just like every other short-lived European war that's happened in the last 20 or so years. We'll be home by Christmas to celebrate with our families, and we'll be national heroes. They found out soon that that's not what's going to happen. In fact, if you didn't die in the trenches before Christmas of 1914, you didn't get home until Christmas of 1918. They also called it the war to end all wars. How optimistic is that? And maybe even arrogant is that, to think that your generation is going to be the one to wipe away war from the history of the world and for the future. And then, of course, they didn't call it World War I. They called it the Great War, which means like big war, but it just kind of, that using that word kind of makes me think of optimism a little bit too. On another note, the government structure of the Allies versus the Central Powers can be contrasted very cleanly. The Ottomans were ruled by a certain king. Do you know what the king of the Ottomans was called? What his title was? Have you ever seen Aladdin? Who's the king in Aladdin? Sultan. Who's the king of Germany? What was his title? Kaiser, which is German for Caesar. Austria-Hungary had an emperor. If we put Belgium up here, Belgium had an emperor too. And so they're all monarchs. Every single one of the Central Powers, all four of them, had kings. So it seems like it's the kings of the world versus the Allies are mostly democracies. Britain has a king, but he's a figurehead. They have a parliament, they're a democracy. France is a democracy. When the United States gets involved, we're a democracy. The only ally that wasn't a democracy was Russia, and their king was called a Tsar. You can spell it this way, or you can spell it P-S-A-R. This is the old-fashioned way of spelling it. P-S-A-R is the new way of spelling it. I do want you to tuck this little tidbit in the back of your mind because this will come up later for one of the reasons why we're getting involved in the war. So hold that back there with Pancho Villa. Remember, as far as the battlefield goes, Austria-Hungary was the first to declare war, but Russia was the first to mobilize troops, but Germany was the first to actually attack, to actually invade. And do you remember who they invaded? Belgium. To get to France. Belgium had nothing to do with it. Belgium was innocent. They didn't have any beef with anybody. They were neutral at that point. And in fact, the Kaiser had painted himself as a peacekeeper. He had gone like the last 20 years trying to go around the world and say, we need peace here, we need peace there, but treaties and treaties, all that kind of stuff, right? He even signed a treaty in like 1912 or something like that, where he had said, if there's ever a war, we don't want there to be a war. I'll do everything I can to keep there from being a war. But if there's a war, we promise, we pledge that we will not invade Belgium. He broke his promise, right? And Britain at the time was kind of trying to stay out of it, but when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain pointed at the treaty and said, look, you signed right here. You said you would never do that. And the Kaiser said, oh, that was just a scrap of paper. And so the British got involved. The Schlieffen plan was Germany's plan to do what? Take over France first, go through Belgium, take out Paris, wipe out France because they're the French. Then concentrate on who? The Russians over on the Eastern Front. And so the Schlieffen Plan was put into effect. The first Battle of the Marne was the battle where they kind of wrap around Paris and they meet the French troops at the Marne River. They don't ignore the Eastern Front. That's what the Battle of Tannenberg is. It's over here within Russia. But it doesn't go as planned, and they never take out France. In fact, trench warfare sets in, and they're stuck there for the next 4 years. Now, the trenches were terrible, and I'm sure you learned about that a little last year. You saw some pictures with County, on Friday. I hope he never hears this because he is real cool. So what if he do more push-ups in my game? There's this one little, sparkling light of humanity that shows up in 1914. It's the day that they should be home, right? They said they were going to be home by this day. It's called the Christmas truce. Somebody always knows something about Christmas truce. Anybody here know the Christmas truce? Who?
France and
Yeah, and Britain. Britain, France on one side, one trench, Germany the other trench. Christmas night, or Christmas day, some Germans start singing the Christmas carol, Stille Nacht, which means silent night. And they're singing in German. The British hear it and they start singing the American version of it. Literally, they get out of the trenches and they meet in the middle of no man's land and they exchange gifts and candy and cigarettes and all that kind of stuff. And they play a little soccer game. The next day they go back to killing each other. But, there's this little tiny glimpse of what we could do if we weren't just so, prideful. And, the next 4 years are in the trenches. The thing that really wins the war eventually for Britain, it takes a while, but they win the war with the blockade. They use their superior navy to blockade Germany, and they start that in 1914. And then, of course, to round out 1914, the Battle of Gallipoli was when Churchill's plan to invade Ottoman Empire fails big time, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's 1914. 1915, first of all, here's a map. Germany can go in the water here on this, eastern part, but if you go up this way, it's kind of like a dead end. It dead ends into Russia, which there's really not a lot of trade going on there. If you want to get to the riches of the outside world, you've got to go this way through Germany, and that's where Britain had the blockade. So Germany had to basically rely on their own supplies for the rest of the war. What's going on in 1915? It's more stalemate in the trenches. A key battle is called the Battle of Verdun. Verdun was a city in France that was like the French patriotic, symbolic city, and so they wanted to do everything they could to keep it in German hands. Get into 1916, the Battle of the Somme was actually a way to relieve pressure on Verdun. It was called the Battle of the Somme River. Now, are there any nerds in here like me that's nerdy enough to have said, I've read and watched all of The Hobbit and all 3 Lord of the Rings books?
I've done that.
I haven't read.
Okay, how many of you have at least read The Hobbit, the short one, the kids one? One, okay. How many of you watched The Hobbit movies? How many of you watched any Lord of the Rings movies? Okay, good. This is the bigger percentage of nerds than any of my other classes. Good job. That's awesome. If you haven't watched them, they're bigger than the Marvel movies, or at least they were at the time. They were huge. Lord of the Rings?
You just get no.
You were like 2.
Yeah, but no, they didn't come out for them like they didn't.
Dressed up as Frodo, yes they did. Legolas with little pointy ears and big bows and arrows. And it won so many Oscars. How many Oscars has any Marvel movie won?
They should.
Serious, but no.
Okay.
Anyway, J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings, right there, he was in this battle. Actually, so was C.S. Lewis, if you've read any of his books. And in this battle, there are so many dead people lying in the marshes and the muck and so on and so forth that he actually wrote about it in the second book of Lord of the Rings. If you've ever heard of the Dead Marshes scene, or seen that in the movie, and where that came from. 1917, what you should put here is not Russia withdrawals, but Russia's revolution. If you want to cross out withdrawals, put revolution, that would be good. Russia will eventually though withdraw, and it's later in 1917 that the United States joins to kind of take Russia's place. In this year, 1917, there's the third battle of the Ypres River. Ypres is Ypres.
What?
Remember, they dropped the French dropped the final consonant.
Hard to
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Take it up with them. This was the British attempt to get into Germany because we haven't gotten into Germany yet. This attempt fails because the British tanks get stuck in the mines and the muck and all the mines that the Germans put up there to explode in the muck. And so we actually the Allies never invaded Germany. The only thing that works on them is the blockade. And the blockade works because in the next year, 1918, there's an internal rebellion against the Kaiser. The people are fed up with the Kaiser's government. They want out of the war because they're hungry and they're starving. They overthrow the Kaiser. The Kaiser goes off to a state in Belgium and lives out his days in comfort while the rest of the world tries to pick up the pieces of World War I. Then in 1918, the blockade works. But as far as I know, not a single Allied soldier ever set foot on German soil during World War I. So the Germans never feel like they actually lost.
Is it foreshadowing?
Yeah, that's what foreshadowing is supposed to do.
Well,
No.
foreshadowing is supposed to, you're not necessarily supposed to know that it's foreshadowing.
Okay. So you can recognize that I'm trying to give you foreshadowing. I'm trying to use foreshadowing. How about that?
Sure.
That's what happens in smart classes. They're always so technical. Okay, what about the other countries? If you cared about the triple entente, whatever. Italy kept Austria-Hungary at bay. They had kind of a mountain war in the Alps there. Russia was fighting the Ottomans, but those are all really minor. I don't really know anything about them, and I don't really care. So the war ends in 1918. The armistice, the ceasefire. Do you know what numbers go in these blanks? 1918, 11th month, 11th day at the 11th hour, 1918. Armistice, the ceasefire was signed. We call November 11th today Veterans Day. It was called Armistice Day before. What about the United States, though? What are we doing during this time besides worrying about Pancho Villa? If you would have asked, if you had taken a poll, should we get involved in the war in Europe? You would have gotten this. Mixed opinion. The nation was divided. Imagine that. America divided on something. All throughout world history, or American history, right? One of the most famous songs of 1914, 1915 was, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I think I put it on there, I didn't raise my son to be a soldier, but same thing. I have no idea on this album cover of this song why there's a Native American chief on there, but you can see here, the war is going on in Europe. This is in their imagination going on right here. They're hearing this news on the radio, and here's this mama's boy. Mom is like, I'm not letting you go, son. I'm making fun of him a little bit, but I shouldn't. I mean, that doesn't look like a very traditional masculine view of manliness, but that was the sentiment. There were many people in the country who bought that song, listened to that song. It was a theme song, like especially in the West, South too, but especially in the West, where Germany is way over here and California is way over here and Texas is way over here. What do they have to do with us? Why do I care about an archduke being assassinated in a place I've never heard of before? Why should I fight in a war that's 4,000 or more miles away? Can you sympathize with that? I mean, how many of us think that we should go invade Russia right now so we can kick them out of the Ukraine? Some people, right? But most people I've got bigger fish to fry. Like literally, am I going to go to Long John Silver's tonight or Taco Bell? Right? I mean, it's the fish we got to fry. And then there was Washington's farewell address. George Washington, the father of our country, the first president of the United States, when he left office, he wrote this long speech where he gave us advice. Two things that we get out of this speech. One, he said, beware of political parties. We didn't take that advice. The second thing was, beware of getting involved in foreign affairs. We didn't take that advice either, right? But here he says, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Because if you have an alliance with Great Britain, they're going to drag you into their wars. If you have an alliance with Germany, they're going to drag you into their wars. It's just going to happen, right? So just stay away. And so there's a lot of people who said we should stay out for that reason. We'll stop there. Please bring this tomorrow. We've got a lot to do. Big plans for this stuff. Thank you for your attention. Make sure you get your missing work in, please.